She was born in 1651 into one of the most powerful families in Europe, the Spanish Habsburgs. To outsiders, her arrival represented the survival of a dynasty that had ruled vast empires across the world. To those who studied her lineage, however, her birth was the visible consequence of centuries of dynastic obsession, a family tree twisted in upon itself, where uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins, and bloodlines folded tighter with each generation. This relentless pursuit of dynastic purity was not born from love or affection, but from a cold political strategy. For the Habsburgs, marrying within the family was seen as a safeguard of legitimacy, a way to keep power concentrated and alliances secure. The price of this strategy, however, was exacted in flesh and bone. Genetic weakness accumulated with every generation, creating children born not only into privilege, but into inevitable suffering. Margarita Teresa would be one of the last and most tragic embodiments of this fatal tradition. Her grandfather, Philip III of Spain, had himself been the product of close kin marriage. Her parents, King Philip IV and his niece Mariana of Austria, deepened this hereditary web. By the time Margarita was born, the inbreeding coefficient of the Spanish Habsburgs was among the highest recorded in European history. Scientists centuries later would analyze their genealogy and conclude that the dynasty had effectively condemned its own offspring. For Margarita, the consequences were not abstract, they were etched into her very body. Observers wrote of her beauty as a child, her golden hair and porcelain complexion. Yet, beneath the painted layers of aristocratic portraiture, the signs of fragility were already present. She tired easily, her growth was stunted, and behind the veil of royal ceremony, her physicians monitored her anxiously, knowing that each new generation of Habsburg children came into the world weaker than the last. The Habsburgs themselves were acutely aware of this pattern. Throughout the court, whispers circulated about the Habsburg jaw, the infamous facial deformity marked by an elongated chin and protruding lower lip. This feature, grotesquely exaggerated over centuries of inbreeding, had become the family's hereditary signature. Margarita bore it lightly, but she carried other, more hidden weaknesses: a body prone to swelling, illness, and early decay. Her condition was not a private tragedy, but a public matter of state. Every nobleman, every ambassador at court, measured her value not by her health, but by her ability to secure alliances and produce heirs. Her body was not her own. It was the vessel of empire, the currency of dynastic survival. From the moment of her birth, she was less a child and more a political instrument. As she grew, the strain of her heritage became more apparent. The constant ceremonies, the suffocating etiquette of the Spanish court placed enormous pressure on a body already weakened. She was carried through endless processions in layers of heavy garments and rigid corsetry, forced to embody imperial majesty even as her strength waned. In public, she was displayed as a symbol of power. In private, she was a young girl suffering under the invisible weight of genetic decline. Portraits by Diego Velázquez immortalized her image for the world. In these masterpieces, Margarita appears regal, luminous, almost divine. Yet these paintings were illusions, carefully constructed masks that concealed the frailty of her health. To posterity, she was remembered as the radiant child princess. To those within the court, the reality was far darker. Her body was betraying her, one symptom at a time, a silent testament to the Habsburgs' ruthless obsession with bloodline purity. In many ways, Margarita was a living contradiction. She represented both the glory and the decay of her dynasty. Her presence reminded Spain of its vast imperial power, but her condition whispered of decline and extinction. Her very existence carried the weight of inevitability, the knowledge that the empire's future lay in a body that was fragile, already rotting from within. For historians, Margarita's short and tragic life reveals the devastating consequences of treating human beings as vessels of power rather than as individuals. Her suffering was not accidental. It was the logical outcome of choices made by generations of rulers who placed empire above humanity. Each cousin marriage, each incestuous union, was a brick laid in the path toward her decay. By the time she reached adolescence, the effects could no longer be disguised. Though celebrated in portraits, admired in ritual, and cherished in ceremony, she was already marked for tragedy. The empire that had demanded her sacrifice would, in turn, be haunted by the consequences. Her birth was meant to symbolize continuity. Instead, it became an omen of collapse. The curse of royal blood was not myth or superstition. It was genetic, undeniable, and merciless, and Margarita Teresa, the child princess painted in splendor, was its most haunting victim. The dynasty she embodied believed it had secured eternity through blood purity. Instead, it sealed its own extinction. In Margarita's fragile body, the glory of empire and the horror of inbreeding converged, a curse written into flesh, destined to end in decay. In the 17th century, royal marriage was not a matter of love, desire, or choice. It was a tool of survival. Dynasties used the bodies of their daughters as pawns on a vast chessboard of power, sacrifice, and bloodline. Few families embodied this truth more brutally than the Habsburgs. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty pursued a vision of purity. In blood, cousins wed cousins, uncles married nieces, and genetic weakness accumulated like rot beneath polished marble. The result was a lineage both powerful and fragile, commanding empires across Europe, but hollowed by physical decline. Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain was born into this heritage. Her body carried the unmistakable traits of the Habsburg curse: a jaw too heavy, a constitution too delicate, and a fate sealed before she could speak her own desires. At 15, she was chosen as a bride not for herself, but for the empire. Her husband would be Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. He was not only twice her age, but also her maternal uncle. In the language of dynastic necessity, this was a union to bind Spain and Austria together, ensuring loyalty between branches of the Habsburg house. In the language of human cruelty, it was incest sanctified by crown and cross. The preparations were vast. Ceremonies framed the marriage as a triumph of diplomacy, a glorious affirmation of unity. Portraits painted for distant courts showed Margarita as a radiant young bride, adorned with silks and jewels, her pale face framed by hair as carefully arranged as her political destiny. Yet behind the painted illusions, the truth was disturbing. She was a child, frail in body, already weakened by hereditary illness, dispatched into the hands of a man who was both kin and sovereign. Leopold I accepted her not as a partner but as a vessel. His duty, like hers, was reproduction, to continue the Habsburg line no matter the cost. To contemporaries, such unions were neither scandal nor sin. The Church blessed them. Political strategists praised them. Only the private suffering of those forced into them was hidden, erased beneath the language of glory. For Margarita, the burden was immediate. The Austrian court was a world of ritual, surveillance, and performance. Every gesture of the young empress was scrutinized. Her body was no longer hers. It was a symbol of alliance and, more importantly, a womb upon which the stability of empires depended. At 15, she was expected to bear children, to endure pregnancies that would strain even the strongest constitution. But hers was already fragile. The Habsburgs had long practiced these incestuous unions, and the toll was visible. Children died in infancy. Adults were plagued by disease, deformity, and early death. Margarita carried this history within her blood, and now it was compounded by the demands of her marriage. Each pregnancy drained her, each miscarriage carved deeper into her frail frame. She endured the agony of forced motherhood not once, but repeatedly, as doctors and priests hovered, prescribing rituals, prayers, and outdated remedies. In the language of statecraft, she had fulfilled her role. In the language of human experience, she was destroyed by it. What her portraits never revealed was the silent suffering, the distended abdomen, the unrelenting pain, the humiliating treatments. Her uncle, husband, continued his reign, commanding armies and attending to affairs of empire, while she withered in the shadows, her youth consumed by childbirth and disease. To modern eyes, such a marriage seems grotesque, but in the 17th century, it was policy. The idea of individual will did not exist for a royal daughter. She was property exchanged between dynastic branches. The irony was tragic. The very marriages meant to preserve the Habsburg dynasty were the same unions that hastened its downfall. Incest did not secure strength. It accelerated weakness, producing heirs too fragile to rule, too diseased to endure. Margarita Teresa of Spain lived barely 6 years after her wedding. She died at 21, her body broken by repeated childbirth and hereditary decay. She was mourned publicly, praised as a dutiful empress, but privately her death was seen as release from agony. The empire continued without her, its machinery of power grinding forward, indifferent to the girl sacrificed in its name. Her marriage was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph, but in truth it was a tragedy. It revealed the inhuman calculus of dynastic politics, where bloodlines mattered more than lives, and where daughters were condemned to suffer so that thrones might endure. Margarita was not remembered for her voice, her will, or her humanity. She was remembered as a link in a chain of alliances, her existence reduced to a political transaction. In the end, her story stands as testimony to a dynasty obsessed with itself. The Habsburgs sought to preserve their power through incest and ritual marriage. What they preserved instead was fragility, decay, and the haunting memory of a child bride who rotted before her time. Her wedding was painted as splendor, her marriage blessed as holy duty. But behind the silks and rituals lay a truth too disturbing to ignore. The empire had devoured its own child. In the decades of Habsburg power, the image of Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain had been carefully cultivated. Portraits painted by Diego Velázquez and his successors showed her as luminous, angelic, and pristine, an embodiment of dynastic pride. But beneath the varnished surfaces of canvas and ceremony, her body was already collapsing under the weight of centuries of inbreeding and the unrelenting burden of political expectation. Within a few short years of her marriage to Emperor Leopold I, Margarita's health began to decline with terrifying speed. Chronic swelling of her abdomen, recorded by members of the court, suggested dropsy, an accumulation of fluids that left her bloated, heavy, and weakened. Her limbs grew distended, her movements labored. At a time when medicine remained entangled with superstition, such symptoms invited both invasive remedies and whispered speculation of curses, divine punishment, or demonic affliction. The physicians of the Habsburg court, men bound more to ritual than reason, turned to the arsenal of early modern medicine: bloodletting, purging, and cauterization. The goal was to balance the humors, believed to dictate health: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. In practice, these treatments blotted her pale, dehydrated her further, and exposed her to infection. Records describe repeated bloodlettings, sometimes until fainting, and the application of leeches to her already fragile skin. Instead of relief, the interventions deepened her exhaustion and accelerated her deterioration. Her pain was constant, and her suffering was not private. Imperial life offered no refuge. Court ceremonies, audiences, and processions demanded her presence, forcing her to appear before nobles and ambassadors, while her body sagged under layers of brocade and jewels. What the world saw was still the empress, but those closest to her began to notice the reality: a woman sinking into decay before her 20th year. Servants noted her struggle to rise from bed, the swelling of her face and limbs, the sour odor of her perspiration and breath. In the 17th century, the line between medicine and ritual was thin. Holy relics were pressed against her body. Priests offered exorcisms when the pain grew unbearable. Physicians advised remedies drawn from astrological charts and herbal mixtures of dubious effect. She was purged with harsh laxatives, her skin blistered by cupping glasses heated and sealed against her flesh. The combination of invasive procedures and religious desperation blurred the boundary between healing and cruelty. Each cure stripped more of her strength, leaving her increasingly skeletal, fragile, and resigned. Her body, once a vessel of dynastic hope, became a source of humiliation. The Habsburg obsession with lineage meant that every sign of her decline carried political weight. A healthy empress meant heirs, a rotting empress meant dynastic danger. Rumors spread quickly through both the Spanish and Austrian courts. Envoys reported back to their monarchs that the young empress was failing, that her health could not sustain the demands of imperial motherhood. Her suffering became international gossip, her body a subject of diplomatic correspondence. Margarita's decline was not simply physical, it was the disintegration of an idea. She had been raised as the product of Habsburg, purity, the offspring of generations of carefully arranged marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins. Her body revealed the truth that the dynasty sought to deny. Such unions did not preserve power, but corroded it from within. The swelling, the weakness, the rotting, all were written in her blood long before her birth. Accounts from attendants describe her attempts to carry out her duties despite worsening agony. At banquets, she struggled to eat. At courtly dances, she collapsed mid-step. Her pregnancies, forced upon her in rapid succession, deepened the burden. Miscarriages drained her further. Stillbirths and infant deaths shattered any illusion of her usefulness as a dynastic bride. Each loss left her more frail, her body more visibly consumed by illness and exhaustion. By her late teens, Margarita was reduced to a shadow of the young girl once captured in portraits. Her face, once bright and round, grew sunken. Her hair thinned, her gait faltered. The once celebrated bride was now the subject of whispered pity and unspoken revulsion. The Spanish court, once so proud of sending her to Vienna as a symbol of power, now received reports of her decline with shame and dread. In the silence of her chambers, away from ceremony, her attendants witnessed the truth, a young woman of imperial birth who moaned through nights of relentless pain, who winced at the touch of healers, whose once white skin bore the marks of cuts, blisters, and sores inflicted in the name of cure. Even in the heart of the empire, surrounded by wealth and ritual, she suffered in ways more brutal than any battlefield. Her decline was not swift, but relentless, a slow unraveling of flesh and spirit. Each year stripped away another piece of her vitality, leaving her more a symbol of dynastic failure than of hope. She was only 20 when her body began to fail beyond repair, but the process had begun long before, written into the very fabric of her inheritance. Her body, once celebrated as an imperial treasure, had become a grotesque warning of a dynasty in decay. In the end, Margarita Teresa of Spain was not destroyed by her enemies, nor by scandal or rebellion, but by the bloodline that had created her. She was a princess reduced to a vessel of suffering, her decline both a personal tragedy and a testament to the cruelty of a dynasty that demanded purity, even at the cost of life itself. The halls of empire were built to awe. Marble corridors stretched into gilded chambers where ritual, ceremony, and divine authority converged to project an image of unshakable majesty. But by the mid-17th century, those same halls carried with them an odor so unbearable that even the most hardened courtiers recoiled. It was not the smoke of burning candles, nor the musk of unwashed garments, nor even the dampness of ancient stone. It was the stench of a princess whose body was disintegrating while she still lived. Margarita Teresa of Spain, daughter of Philip IV, was born into the Habsburg dynasty, a dynasty that had for centuries pursued purity of blood at the expense of vitality. Generations of marriages between cousins, uncles, and nieces had turned the royal line into a fragile experiment in survival. From the beginning, her fate had been inscribed not only in treaties and succession papers, but in the very structure of her body. At court, appearances mattered above all else. Every gesture, every meal, every word was staged as theater, designed to convince subjects and foreign envoys of divine order. Yet, within these immaculate rituals, the princess's failing health became an open secret. She was observed to swell unnaturally, her abdomen distended, her skin breaking out in sores. The court physicians, bound to archaic practices, attempted to purge her of what they considered excess humors. But their ministrations did not cure. Instead, her flesh weakened, fluids leaked from her body, and an odor began to emanate from her person that no remedy could contain. Those forced into proximity, servants, ladies in waiting, even high-ranking nobles, found themselves overwhelmed. They pressed handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater to their faces. They burned incense in her chambers until the smoke itself irritated their lungs. Still, the smell lingered, stronger than prayer, heavier than ritual. It clung to fabrics, seeped into cushions, and settled into the very timbers of the palace. The Spanish court, famed for its rigid etiquette, could not ignore what the senses demanded they acknowledge. The princess was rotting before their eyes. The humiliation was not hers alone, for in a dynasty that claimed divine mandate, any sign of physical imperfection was interpreted as a flaw in the order of heaven itself. Envoys from foreign courts recorded discreetly in their correspondence the shocking decline of the young princess. What had been painted in oils by Velázquez as angelic vitality now confronted observers as a body that could not sustain itself. Behind the ceremonial veil of empire, reality seeped out in the form of an unbearable smell. To those who attended her, the contradiction was grotesque. She was still dressed in fine silks, adorned with jewelry, and paraded at rituals that demanded reverence. Yet beneath the layers of cloth and gold, her skin festered. The contrast between the carefully constructed image of purity and the sensory assault of decay created a form of cruelty no executioner could design. She was made both an idol and a spectacle, revered in paintings yet repulsive in life. The odor became more than a personal misfortune. It was political embarrassment. The Habsburgs sought to bind their empire through displays of stability and strength. But their obsession with blood purity, their reliance on incestuous unions to secure alliances, had instead produced weakness so visible it could be smelled across a chamber. The dynasty's genetic collapse could no longer be hidden behind portraits or proclamations. It was embodied in Margarita, whose every breath carried the weight of decline. Courtiers whispered. Some spoke of God's punishment, others of witchcraft, and still others dared to question the wisdom of marriages that united uncle with niece, cousin with cousin. But no one spoke too loudly. To insult the princess was to risk treason, and so the silence was maintained, broken only by the discreet gesture of nobles raising perfumed cloths to their faces whenever she entered the hall. Her humiliation deepened as the years passed. The odor, once faint, became suffocating. Servants rotated quickly, unable to endure long shifts in her chambers. Physicians attempted desperate measures, bleeding her, burning her skin with heated irons, and prescribing draughts that only increased her agony. None of it lessened the stench. Instead, it compounded her suffering, transforming her into a figure both pitied and despised. By the time of her early death, she was not remembered for her voice, her laughter, or her mind. She was remembered for the smell. It lingered in the memories of courtiers as something more than physical decay. It was symbolic rot, the smell of a dynasty consuming itself from within. The empire had demanded her body as a vessel of alliance, as proof of continuity. What it received was a grotesque reminder that power built on corruption of blood cannot escape the cruelty of nature. Her chambers were emptied, her body entombed, and incense once again filled the air. But the memory remained, unspoken yet unforgettable. The empire that had demanded her sacrifice could erase her face from ritual, but it could never erase the smell of decay that once haunted its halls. In the end, it was not disease alone that destroyed her, but the dynasty itself, a family so consumed by its pursuit of purity that it bred its own corruption into the very flesh of its children. In the 17th century, European medicine was an uneasy blend of science, mysticism, and ritual. The Habsburg court, wrapped in its traditions of ceremony and Catholic devotion, demanded that illness be confronted with both learned physicians and holy men. When Princess Margarita Teresa's health began to decline, her body became the canvas on which these rituals of medicine and madness were enacted. The first line of defense was bloodletting, a treatment so common it was prescribed for almost every ailment, from fever to melancholy. Physicians pressed leeches to her tender skin, drawing out what they claimed were the corrupt humors poisoning her body. Each session left her weaker, paler, and more prone to infection. Yet when she failed to improve, the solution was not to question the practice but to repeat it, convinced that the fault lay in her stubborn illness rather than in their methods. Purging followed. Her stomach was flooded with emetics, forcing her into violent retching and diarrhea. The theory was simple: if disease was caused by imbalance, then expelling matter from the body might restore harmony. In reality, the princess endured repeated dehydration, internal tearing, and unbearable exhaustion. Courtiers whispered of her groans, echoing through the chambers after nights of uncontrollable sickness. But still the physicians persisted, convinced each purge might be the one to cleanse her entirely. Cupping and cauterization were considered more aggressive interventions. Heated glass cups were pressed against her flesh to draw blood to the surface, leaving behind swollen welts and dark bruises. When this too failed, iron rods were heated in the fire and applied to her skin. The rationale was that cauterization might burn out the disease, searing the corruption within. But all it burned was her already fragile body, leaving scars that neither ointment nor prayer could soothe. Superstition, woven tightly into medicine, added another layer of torment. Holy relics were brought to her bedside, fragments of saints' bones, crucifixes, and shrouds pressed against her blistering skin. Priests chanted exorcisms, declaring that unseen forces, perhaps even demonic ones, were at the root of her suffering. Physicians, unwilling to confront their ignorance, did not resist these rituals. Instead, religion and medicine became one. The whip of penance combined with the knife of the surgeon. Some treatments bordered on the grotesque. Mercury, thought to drive out illness, was administered despite its toxic effects. Baths infused with herbs and animal parts were prepared, their vapors filling her chambers with pungent odors. She was smeared with ointments made of lard, vinegar, and ground minerals. At times, she was forced to drink concoctions of crushed gemstones and powders of gold, remedies that were more symbolic than medicinal, believed to infuse her with strength and nobility. In truth, they ravaged her organs and offered no relief. The cruelty of these practices was not perceived as such by her attendants. To them, they were acts of loyalty, of service to their sovereign family. Each burn, each desperate ritual was seen as a duty, a necessary sacrifice to keep the princess alive long enough to fulfill her dynastic role. Yet behind this facade of devotion lay indifference. Her body was not treated as human, but as a vessel of lineage, a possession of the state. What made these rituals even more disturbing was the performance that surrounded them. Treatments were carried out in her gilded chambers, in full view of attendants who stood silently, watching a young woman writhe in agony as priests mumbled prayers and physicians recorded her responses. Suffering became spectacle, an imperial display of both medical authority and religious devotion. The princess endured it all with dwindling strength. Each new cure left her closer to death, her flesh marked by scars, her spirit crushed by humiliation. What dignity remained to her was stripped away, replaced by the stench of ointments, the stains of bloodletting, and the murmurs of priests declaring her cursed. In this world, the line between healing and cruelty no longer existed. Treatments became punishments, and superstition became justification for torture. Her body was sacrificed not only to illness, but to the rituals of medicine itself. Rituals that revealed more about the fears and ignorance of her society than about her condition. By the time her decline became irreversible, she had suffered not just from disease, but from the relentless interventions meant to cure her. In seeking to preserve her life, they had accelerated her destruction, and in their failure, they exposed the darkest truth of early modern medicine, that in the absence of knowledge, desperation breeds cruelty. In the end, she was not healed but broken, consumed by the very hands that claimed to save her. Her death was not solely the work of illness, but of the rituals that mistook suffering for salvation. In the rigid halls of the Habsburg dynasty, the body of Margarita Teresa of Spain was never her own. She had been born into fragility, the legacy of centuries of inbreeding. By the time she became the bride of her maternal uncle, Emperor Leopold I, her health was already unraveling. Yet her worth to the empire was measured not by vitality, not by intellect or spirit, but by her womb. The continuation of the dynasty demanded heirs, and the body of a young woman, sickly, rotting, and weak, was forced to bear the impossible weight of succession. Her marriage began in ritual splendor, but behind the glittering ceremonies lay a grim reality. Margarita, scarcely 15, entered into a union designed not for love but for reproduction. The empire cared little for her faltering body. Every chamber of the Austrian court whispered the same question: when would she give birth? When would she secure the Habsburg line? In this question, her humanity disappeared. The pregnancies came, each one carving deeper wounds into her frail health. The strain was evident almost immediately. Accounts speak of her swollen body, of exhaustion so profound she could barely walk, of infections that lingered and festered. But physicians, bound to superstition and dynastic orders, did not question the wisdom of forcing her into motherhood. Bloodletting, purges, and prayers were their answer to her agony. For the princess herself, there was no reprieve. Her suffering was transformed into duty, her agony into loyalty. The first children were born weak, frail, and doomed. Infant mortality was no stranger to the 17th century, but in Margarita's case, the cycle of birth and death was a cruel echo of her own condition. Miscarriages racked her, leaving her bleeding and fevered. Yet immediately the pressure returned. She was reminded that she was more vessel than woman. The court's expectation was unrelenting, to produce life even as she edged closer to death. Motherhood in the court of the Habsburgs was not tenderness, it was strategy. Each pregnancy was a political act, a chance to secure alliances, to fortify the dynasty against its enemies, to produce another pawn in the great imperial game. And so the empire pressed forward, blind to the personal torment of the young empress. Her body rotted under the weight of these demands. The stench of her decaying flesh, already whispered of in the court, grew stronger with each pregnancy. Servants recoiled, courtiers carried perfumed satchels. Physicians dressed her sores, but the smell persisted, a reminder that her flesh could not sustain the burden placed upon it. Yet still she was forced to try again, to conceive again, to bleed again. In this endless cycle of expectation, Margarita's health spiraled downward. Her pregnancies were marked not by joy but by dread, for each one brought new suffering and deeper decline. Records describe her illnesses, the infections that would not heal, the exhaustion that consumed her. Still, Leopold and his court demanded more. Her personal pain mattered less than the empire's desperate need for continuity. She endured stillbirths and infant deaths. Each child lost was a personal tragedy that the court reframed as failure. Not the fault of fate, not the cruelty of genetics, but of her fragile body, her inability to fulfill her role. Grief was not permitted space, her womb was too valuable for mourning. For Margarita, motherhood was agony without reprieve. It was an unending ritual of pain, humiliation, and expectation. She was paraded as mother to heirs, yet she could not keep her children alive. Her body betrayed her, just as her dynasty betrayed her humanity. In the name of empire, she was consumed alive, piece by piece, pregnancy by pregnancy, until little remained but the shadow of a woman broken by bloodlines and dynastic obsession. By her early 20s, the toll was irreversible. Each pregnancy shortened her life, hastened her decay, and pulled her closer to the grave. She lived not as a woman, not even as an empress, but as a womb collapsing under the weight of empire. And when she finally died at the age of 21, it was not childbirth that claimed her, but the slow, merciless rot of a body forced beyond endurance. In death, her body was mourned as a symbol of dynastic tragedy, but in life, she was treated as little more than a vessel. Motherhood was her torment, her prison, her executioner, and in the silent chambers of history, Margarita, Teresa of Spain, remains not remembered for her children, but for the agony of being forced to bear them. The marriage of Margarita Teresa of Spain to her maternal uncle, Emperor Leopold I of Austria, was celebrated as a triumph of dynastic unity. To the Habsburg court, it was a perfect arrangement. The Spanish crown preserved its inheritance, while the Austrian line strengthened its hold on imperial Europe. But beneath the gold, threaded banners and solemn processions, this marriage was a calculated cruelty. It bound together bloodlines already weakened by generations of inbreeding. It fused power with pathology, sealing the young woman's fate in silence and slow decay. The Habsburgs had long practiced consanguineous marriages, repeating unions between cousins, uncles, and nieces. This was not out of ignorance but deliberate strategy, a refusal to let foreign blood dilute their claims to empire. Over centuries, this obsession with purity produced a lineage marked by deformity, infertility, and degenerative illness. The infamous Habsburg jaw, protruding and grotesque, was only the visible sign of a deeper corruption in the blood. Margarita's very birth was already a product of this dynastic self-destruction. Her marriage to Leopold only compounded the damage. At just 15, Margarita became both wife and niece to the emperor. Publicly, the marriage was paraded as sacred duty. Privately, it was incest disguised as statecraft. The young bride was expected to serve not as a partner, but as a vessel. Her womb was the empire's concern, her health expendable. For Leopold, she was both symbol and possession, proof that the Spanish crown remained tethered to Vienna, while he pursued the expansion of his imperial authority across Europe. For Margarita, it was betrayal in its cruelest form, kinship wielded as a weapon. Her family cloaked their exploitation in the language of loyalty and faith. Her mother had already prepared her for this fate. knowing that the dynasty demanded obedience above survival. To the Habsburgs, blood was not a bond of care but of control. They would sacrifice daughters, nieces, and sisters alike to preserve political continuity. To betray their women was not betrayal at all, it was policy, and in Margarita's case, it was policy that would destroy her from within. While Leopold basked in the glory of imperial campaigns and grand political marriages among his other relatives, Margarita's existence was increasingly confined to sick rooms. She suffered swelling, exhaustion, and bodily decline, yet her cries were muffled by ritual and etiquette. Courtiers maintained the illusion of prosperity, even as her body rotted in private. Physicians, loyal to the crown's expectations, reported her fertility rather than her pain. In letters, she was described as delicate, obedient, and pious. Rarely was she described as human. This was betrayal by silence, a refusal to acknowledge her suffering, because to acknowledge it was to confront the monstrous truth of dynastic incest. The Habsburgs knew her health was fragile. They knew that her pregnancies endangered her life, yet they demanded them anyway. The state required heirs, not daughters. The result was repeated trauma, miscarriages, stillbirths, and children who died within months of birth. Each attempt to produce an heir cost Margarita another fragment of her failing body. Leopold himself, though outwardly pious and ceremonious, contributed to this betrayal through indifference. His role as emperor overshadowed any role as husband. He expanded the reach of the Holy Roman Empire, negotiated alliances, and waged wars that reshaped European borders. But for his young wife there was no protection, no refuge from the suffocating demands of family and crown. His expansion was mirrored by her contraction. As his empire grew, her body collapsed. What makes this betrayal so horrifying is not a single act of cruelty, but its normalization. No one at court questioned the ethics of a 15-year-old niece married to her uncle. No one challenged the necessity of her repeated pregnancies despite her failing health. No one resisted the dynasty's demand for purity of blood, even as it killed those forced to embody it. The betrayal was systemic, woven into the very fabric of empire, hidden behind the glittering masks of power. Margarita's fate was sealed long before her marriage. She was born not as a child but as a pawn, her life mapped out by the intersecting lines of dynasty and blood. In the end, she was left to rot while others flourished. Her body sacrificed for a legacy that crumbled soon after her death. Her family betrayed her not with violence of the sword, but with the violence of expectation, silence, and deliberate neglect. And so, the great empire that celebrated itself in marble halls and painted portraits hid the truth of its own decay. The betrayal of Margarita Teresa was not unique. She was one of many sacrificed in the Habsburg obsession with itself, consumed by the very blood that should have protected her. Her marriage was celebrated as triumph, but it was triumph built on her suffering. Her family clothed their betrayal in velvet and ritual. But the stench of her decay told the truth. She died not by enemy hands, but by the embrace of her own bloodline, a victim of loyalty twisted into cruelty. In the grand tradition of the Spanish Habsburg court, portraiture was more than art. It was propaganda. The brushstrokes of Diego Velázquez and his followers were not mere depictions of faces and forms, but instruments of power designed to shape how the world would remember the dynasty. And at the center of this spectacle stood Margarita Teresa, the child who would be a queen and the woman who would rot before her time. The paintings show her solemn, poised, her pale face framed by cascades of hair, her gown stiff with embroidery and gold. Every detail reinforced a message here was purity, majesty, divine grace wrapped in human form. Yet even as these portraits were unveiled to the courts of Europe, the reality was slipping into grotesque decline. Margarita's body, warped by centuries of inbreeding, had already begun to collapse. Her health was failing, her flesh breaking down. The odor that clung to her chambers seeped through the palace, whispered about in shame and disgust. But none of this was permitted to reach the canvases. The Habsburgs understood that image was survival. A dynasty already weakened by illness and internal decay could not afford to appear vulnerable. So artists were instructed, directly or through the suffocating rituals of court etiquette, to conceal the truth. Where her body had swelled grotesquely, they painted symmetry. Where her face had grown drawn, discolored, or scarred, they rendered smooth skin and calm dignity. The paintings were masks, as carefully constructed as the jeweled gowns she wore to cover her wasting frame. For the court, the portraits were not simply flattering images. They were weapons. A marriage alliance depended upon them. A dynasty's prestige relied upon them. The canvases were sent across Europe as tokens of her supposed vitality, to reassure distant monarchs and suitors that the empire's bloodline remained strong. They were false promises painted in oil, illusions designed to hide a failing reality. Velázquez, celebrated as a master of realism, found himself caught in the contradiction. His brush, capable of capturing the harsh lines of age and the weight of mortality, was turned into a tool of erasure. For Margarita, the painter's skill became a prison. Her suffering body was erased with every stroke, her true condition hidden beneath layers of paint. She was made eternal not as she was, but as the court wished her to be. The cruelty of this deception lay not only in the lies it told the world, but in the denial it imposed upon her. The princess who reeked of decay, who limped through the halls in pain, could not even claim her own image. She was transformed into a symbol against her will, a banner of splendor for an empire crumbling from within. The dissonance between her lived body and her painted self deepened her humiliation. In her lifetime, she was already a ghost of herself, and yet on canvas she was radiant, eternal. This practice was not unique to Margarita. Across Europe, portraits of rulers masked the pox scars, the gout, the deformities that plagued royal families. But in the Spanish Habsburg line, the gap between illusion and reality was wider, more grotesque, because their obsession with pure blood had produced bodies ravaged by hereditary weakness. The portraits were more than vanity. They were desperate attempts to disguise a family line already teetering on the brink of extinction. When foreign envoys viewed her likeness, they saw only the majesty the court wanted them to see. Few knew that behind the painted eyes lay a body racked with pain, a womb struggling through miscarriages, a life reduced to endurance. The empire did not want the truth of Margarita's suffering to be known, because the truth exposed the decay of the Habsburg name itself. Even in death, the deception endured. Portraits continued to circulate, images of her forever youthful, poised, and elegant. But beneath the layers of varnish, beneath the centuries of admiration for Velázquez's artistry, lies a far darker reality. The portraits stand as monuments to cruelty, not because they captured her, but because they erased her. They silenced the stench, the sores, the humiliation. They made her suffering invisible, even as it consumed her. The mask of courtly splendor was not only Margarita's burden, it was the Habsburgs' last defense against the truth of their decline. Behind the shimmering images, their empire was collapsing under the weight of its own blood. The portraits survive today in museums, admired as masterpieces of art. But to understand them fully is to recognize them for what they were: lies painted over wrought, eternal illusions concealing unbearable truth. The canvas showed beauty, but the air around her stank of decay. The Habsburg dynasty immortalized its princess not as she was, but as it needed her to be, a radiant mask over a rotting body. The portraits endure as art, but they are also monuments to deception, cruelty, and the silence imposed upon a suffering child of empire. In the final years of her short life, Margarita Teresa of Spain became the most tragic symbol of the Habsburg dynasty's self-destruction. What had begun as a political arrangement, a marriage intended to strengthen dynastic ties, ended in the slow physical disintegration of a young woman whose body was never her own. By the time she reached 21, her health had failed so catastrophically that her presence in the court was less a reminder of power than a stench-filled testament to decline. The symptoms of her decay were recorded with grim detachment by court physicians and foreign observers alike. They described her abdomen grotesquely swollen, her legs too weak to bear weight, and her breathing shallow and labored. Her skin, once painted into portraits of radiant innocence, began to crack, blister, and exude fluids that no ointment could mask. Servants whispered of the odor that clung to her rooms, an unmistakable reminder that the flesh of this young empress was rotting while she yet lived. The cause was not a mystery to history. Generations of inbreeding had left the Habsburg line riddled with congenital defects. Margarita, the child of uncle and niece, embodied the consequences of centuries of dynastic obsession. Her body was fragile from birth, her immune system weakened, her organs compromised. Every pregnancy inflicted further damage, and every failed remedy deepened her decline. By the time she bore her fourth child, she had lost all reserves of strength. She was a queen consort in name, but in reality, a prisoner inside a body that betrayed her with each passing month. Doctors, clinging to the medical beliefs of the 17th century, attempted treatment after treatment that bordered on torture. Bloodletting left her weak and pale. Purges stripped her body of what little nourishment it could retain. Hot irons and caustic poultices were pressed to her sores in the belief that corruption of the humors could be drawn out through pain. At times she was forced to swallow concoctions of mercury and crushed gemstones, believed to restore vitality, but more often hastening decline. With every procedure, her dignity dissolved further, and her suffering became a spectacle. Behind the locked doors of her chambers, the atmosphere was suffocating. Incense and perfumes were burned continuously to mask the smell of putrefaction. Courtiers who once celebrated her beauty avoided her presence, covering their faces with scented handkerchiefs when protocol demanded attendance. Her husband, Emperor Leopold I, continued with his political ambitions, leaving Margarita in her misery, her role reduced to the desperate production of heirs and the concealment of her disintegration. Her last months were marked by isolation. Even her children, fragile themselves, were often kept at a distance. The imperial family did not wish to parade weakness, and the sight of Margarita's condition was weakness incarnate. Yet she was not forgotten entirely. To the empire, her suffering was a secret shame, whispered about in letters between courts. To Spain, her death would mean the extinguishing of hope for the preservation of Habsburg bloodlines. And so, even as her body failed, she remained trapped in a role she had never chosen, the rotting embodiment of a dynasty's obsession with itself. When death finally came, it was not swift. Accounts suggest prolonged agony, fever, convulsions, fluids seeping from her body faster than attendants could clean them away. Her skin split open, her teeth loosened, her frame collapsed into something unrecognizable. At just 21 years of age, she resembled not a young empress but an emaciated corpse, decomposing while her heart still struggled to beat. The Spanish princess, who had once been painted in luminous silks by Velázquez, was reduced to a body that courtiers prayed would finally give out. Her death in March 1673 was marked by public mourning, as was expected of an imperial consort. Bells rang, masses were said, and Europe was told of the passing of a cherished figure. Yet behind the ceremonial mourning, there lingered an unspoken relief. The stench that had haunted the palace was gone. The unbearable reminder of the dynasty's fragility had been buried. The empire could move forward, even as it quietly acknowledged that the Habsburg experiment with purity of blood had claimed another victim. In the aftermath, her image was preserved not through the truth of her final months, but through paintings that denied reality. She lived on in oils as a serene, doll-like figure, a mask for the horror of her true decline. History remembered the portraits, not the sores. The dynasty preserved its illusions, as dynasties always had, yet beneath the gilded frames the reality remained. Margarita Teresa had died in a state so grotesque that her body itself had become a metaphor for the rot of the empire she represented. Her final decay was not only the end of a woman, but the silent collapse of a dynasty's illusion. In the secrecy of her chambers, where perfumes fought against the inevitable, the Habsburgs faced the truth they could never confess, that their obsession with themselves had poisoned their own blood. And in Margarita's body, the dynasty's corruption had finally taken visible, undeniable form. Her corpse was buried with royal honors, yet her life was consumed by humiliation and pain. She was remembered as a princess, a wife, a mother, but more than anything, she was the rotting emblem of a family destroying itself from within. In her final decay, the Habsburg Empire witnessed its own. The death of Margarita Teresa in 1673 marked more than the end of a young woman's suffering. It stood as a visible sign of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty's long decline. a decline accelerated by centuries of genetic entrapment and political choices made in the pursuit of absolute control. Her body, broken and rotting before its time, became a grim metaphor for a family and an empire that had consumed itself from within. For generations, the Habsburgs had intermarried obsessively, binding cousins, uncles, and nieces in unions designed to keep territories within the dynasty. They saw themselves as guardians of divine order, chosen to rule not just Spain, but vast realms stretching from the Low Countries to the Americas, from Italy to the Philippines. Yet the very bloodline they prized became their undoing. Each marriage narrowed the gene pool further, producing heirs who were fragile, sickly, and often incapable of effective rule. Margarita Teresa was both victim and symbol of this practice. Married to her own maternal uncle, Leopold I, her life illustrated the grotesque extent to which dynastic ambition outweighed human well-being. Her body bore the marks of the genetic distortions that plagued the family. She struggled through multiple pregnancies, her health deteriorating with each one, until her death at just 21. The court attempted to preserve dignity through ritual and ceremony, but the reality was undeniable. The royal family was collapsing from within. This was not only a private matter of family health, it had direct consequences for the fate of nations. With Margarita gone, and with the Spanish King Charles I, her younger brother, left as the last surviving male heir, the dynasty's future stood on fragile ground. Charles himself embodied the disastrous effects of centuries of inbreeding. He was physically deformed, mentally impaired, and chronically ill. His inability to govern effectively left Spain vulnerable, both internally and on the European stage. The rot of the Habsburg dynasty was mirrored in the empire they ruled. By the late 17th century, Spain was no longer the unchallenged superpower it had once been. The wealth of the Americas flowed into its treasuries, but the empire was exhausted. Wars against France and the Dutch Republic drained resources. The Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean demanded constant vigilance. Yet at the heart of the empire, the monarchy itself was crumbling. The dynasty's genetic weakness translated into political instability, indecision, and an inability to adapt. Margarita's death underscored a horrifying truth. The pursuit of dynastic purity had produced dynastic suicide. What had been justified as preservation of royal legitimacy had in fact corroded the very foundation of the monarchy. The Spanish Habsburg line was ending not with strength, but with fragility, not with majesty, but with decay. Historians have long debated whether the decline of Spain was inevitable or accelerated by dynastic weakness. But in the 17th century, contemporaries already saw the pattern. Foreign courts mocked the Spanish monarchy, whispering of its cursed bloodline. The figure of Charles II, often called the Bewitched, was treated as both a tragedy and an embarrassment. A king unable to produce an heir, unable to rule effectively, and unable to escape the legacy of centuries of inbreeding. Margarita's fate had been sealed by forces larger than herself. She was raised not as a daughter but as a dynastic pawn, her marriage a contract, her body a vessel. The humiliation she endured, the stench of her illness, the whispers at court, the indifference of those who saw her only as a means of securing succession, all reflected the cruelty of a system that valued power above humanity. In this sense, her death was not only a biological failure, but a moral one. The dynasty's collapse after her death came quickly. Within just a few decades, the Spanish Habsburg line ended with the death of Charles II in 1700. His passing ignited the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that dragged Europe into chaos for more than a decade. The empire that had once dominated continents now became the subject of division among foreign powers. The dynasty's obsession with blood purity had left nothing but weakness behind. In the aftermath, the Bourbon dynasty replaced the Habsburgs on the Spanish throne. New blood would rule, but the memory of what had been lost remained. The story of Margarita Teresa and her siblings was not forgotten. To many, it stood as a lesson in the dangers of hubris, the arrogance of believing that divine right and dynastic purity could defy nature itself. Nature, in the end, exacted its revenge. The ruin of the Spanish Habsburgs was not sudden but gradual, a slow decay mirrored in the bodies of its rulers. Margarita's brief, Tormented life was part of that decay, her rotting flesh a symbol of an empire that could not escape its own choices. Her suffering echoed far beyond the palace walls, for it was bound inseparably to the collapse of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Her body rotted in youth, and with it rotted the legacy of her family. The Spanish Habsburgs had sought immortality through purity, but in the end they achieved only extinction. The empire they built decayed just as their blood did, leaving behind a dynasty remembered not for its glory, but for its ruin. History often remembers monarchs and nobles as symbols of power, wealth, and divine order. Yet among the great dynasties of Europe, there were figures whose very existence testified to the destructive obsession with bloodlines. One of the most haunting examples was Margarita Teresa of Spain, a princess immortalized in brushstrokes, yet remembered in whispers as the rotting body of the Habsburg court. Her story reveals not only the suffering of one woman, but the cruelty of a system that sacrificed human lives for the illusion of dynastic purity. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty was notorious for its relentless inbreeding. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and generation after generation collapsed into a genetic prison of deformities, infertility, and frailty. By the 17th century, their faces carried the infamous Habsburg jaw. Their bodies bore the weight of hidden illnesses, and their children were born weaker with each passing union. Margarita Teresa embodied this collapse. She was born in 1651, the beloved daughter of King Philip I of Spain, but her blood carried the degeneration of centuries. As a child, Margarita was celebrated in portraits by Diego Velázquez, who painted her in lavish gowns and silver brocades. To the world, she appeared a radiant princess, destined to secure alliances between the great Catholic powers of Europe. Yet even in her youth, her health faltered. The very blood that made her a symbol of dynastic strength was already undermining her body. At just 15, she was forced into marriage with her uncle, Emperor Leopold I of Austria. It was an arrangement designed not for love, nor even for stability, but for survival of the dynasty. By marrying his own niece, Leopold sought to strengthen Habsburg bloodlines across Spain and Austria. What the empire celebrated as unity was, in truth, incest sealed with ceremony. For Margarita, it was the beginning of a life consumed by decline. Her body, weakened by genetics and further broken by repeated pregnancies, began to fail. She suffered from swollen limbs, relentless pain, and the grotesque bloating that left her barely able to walk. Physicians prescribed endless bloodletting, purges, and poultices, treatments rooted in medieval superstition rather than science. Each attempt to heal her left her weaker, more ravaged. And soon, the court began to notice the smell. Accounts spoke of a stench so unbearable that courtiers carried perfumed cloths to mask it. Servants recoiled when tasked with tending to her chambers. Even in the rituals of public life, where the princess was expected to embody dignity and grace, the air around her betrayed her suffering. She was a living emblem of decay, her body turning against her in plain sight of Europe's most powerful court. The humiliation was total. For a woman raised to represent purity, fertility, and divine order, to be marked instead by rot was more than a personal tragedy. It was a political shame. The empire that had demanded her body as a vessel for heirs now recoiled from the consequences of its own choices. Behind closed doors, she was treated with pity or avoidance. Publicly, her suffering was erased, replaced with idealized images that denied the truth. Despite her agony, Margarita endured repeated pregnancies. Her first child died in infancy, miscarriages followed. Each attempt at producing heirs left her more broken. By 21, her body could bear no more. In 1673, she died in Vienna, her corpse already rotting before her final breath escaped. For the Habsburgs, it was a devastating blow. For her, it was an end to torment that had defined every year of her short life. What remains of Margarita Teresa is not her suffering, but her portraits. The serene face painted by Velázquez hangs in galleries across the world, admired as one of Spain's most iconic images of royal innocence. Yet these images lie. They silence the unbearable truth, the odor, the sores, the humiliation of a young woman forced to carry the dynasty's curse. Her body was consumed in service to power, and her pain was buried beneath the glittering mask of monarchy. In the centuries that followed, the Habsburg dynasty collapsed. Spain lost its dominance. Austria fractured and the royal line weakened to extinction. Historians point to politics, economics, and war, but beneath it all lay the physical ruin of a family consumed by its own obsession with purity. Margarita Teresa was both victim and symbol of that ruin, a reminder of the human cost of political survival at any price. The silence around her life is perhaps the cruelest legacy. She was remembered not as she lived, but as art portrayed her. A child frozen in silk, a bride adorned with jewels, an empress erased of her suffering. Only the whispered memories of her stench survived in the corridors of court, too shameful to be written into chronicles, too human to be painted into portraits. Her life exposes the brutal truth that power often hides. Behind every throne, behind every dynasty, lay the bodies of those consumed by it. Margarita Teresa's decay was not simply a personal tragedy, but a revelation of the empire's own corruption. The silence that followed was not kindness, but denial, and so she endures in history not only as a painted child, but as the rotting princess, a human body destroyed by political ambition, and a ghostly reminder that power, pursued at all costs, leaves only the smell of death. Her portraits endure, her face preserved, but her truth was hidden in silence, and her body betrayed by blood. The dynasty that destroyed her would not survive her century, but the memory of her odor lingered far longer than the empire itself. History has long glorified the great dynasties of Europe, their crowns, their palaces, their painted portraits. But behind the splendor of the Habsburg dynasty lay a silent, rotting truth. Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain, celebrated in canvases by Velázquez, remembered as a jewel of imperial beauty, lived and died as a victim of her own bloodline. Her tragedy was not only personal, it was the dying breath of a family consumed by its obsession with purity. The lesson buried in her decay was a warning that empire itself could rot when it sacrificed humanity at the altar of power. The Habsburgs, with their notorious tradition of marrying within the family, believed they were preserving divine right and sacred blood. Instead, they condemned generation after generation to weakness, deformity, and disease. Margarita's brief life, ending in grotesque suffering, revealed what centuries of dynastic arrogance had created a body that became a tomb long before death. She had been born with the weight of empire pressing upon her. Her marriage was arranged not for affection or choice, but as a political instrument. Bound to her own uncle, Leopold I, in the rigid logic of dynasty, her womb was her only true value. Each pregnancy further tore apart her failing body, each miscarriage deepened the shadow of despair. Her role was not that of a woman, but of a vessel, her humanity erased beneath the demands of succession. The cruelty was not unique to her. Throughout Europe, royal women endured similar fates, reduced to their reproductive capacity, stripped of identity beyond the hairs they might bear. But Margarita's story carried an additional horror. Her body itself rebelled against the life forced upon it. The stench that haunted her palace halls was not a metaphor. It was the literal decay of a young woman consumed by genetic collapse, her flesh deteriorating while courtiers whispered and priests prayed. What the portraits concealed, history struggled to confront. Velázquez painted her in silken gowns, her face serene, her presence radiant. To the world, she remained an image of noble beauty. Yet those who stood near her knew the unbearable truth. Behind the perfumes and incense, behind the marble facades of courtly ritual, a princess was rotting alive. The empire chose not to see her suffering, for acknowledging it would mean acknowledging its own complicity. Her death at just 21 years old marked more than the loss of a daughter, a wife, a mother. It symbolized the decay of the Spanish Habsburg line itself. Within decades, the dynasty would collapse, leaving Spain weakened and divided, its empire fractured. The obsession with blood purity, pursued for centuries, had ensured its own destruction. Margarita's body was not merely a victim of disease. It was the mirror of a dynasty's suicide. The silence that followed her death was perhaps the most chilling cruelty of all. Historians spoke of her marriage, her children, her role in the succession. Few dared describe the reality of her suffering, the odor that filled the air, the humiliation of her decay. She was remembered as an empress consort, a figure in paintings and entry in genealogies. But her humanity, her torment, her truth, these were buried. And yet, the lesson remained unspoken but undeniable. Power without humanity corrodes. Dynasties built on incest and exploitation do not preserve glory. They breed weakness, despair, and collapse. To look upon Margarita's life is to confront the inhumanity of treating women as mere instruments, of reducing human beings to pawns of empire. Her tragedy forces reflection beyond the marble walls of her time. It compels us to ask how often history has disguised cruelty with ceremony, how many voices have been silenced beneath the grandeur of power. Margarita's story is not only that of one princess in Spain. It is the story of countless women erased, diminished, and sacrificed in the service of dynastic ambition. Her odor, whispered through the royal halls, became the empire's unspoken shame, and though history painted her in beauty, the truth rotted beneath the canvas. That is the legacy she leaves us, not one of splendor, but of warning. A reminder that beneath the crowns and the portraits, beneath the hymns and the rituals, lies the suffering of human bodies broken for power. The lesson buried in her rot is simple, and devastating empires that dehumanize their own will one day crumble, leaving only the stench of what they once were.